The world knew Little Richard as rock and roll's wild prince. But on that autumn night in 1957, 30,000 feet above Australia, the suitcases were packed and God was calling. Elvis had just claimed his throne, the Beatles were still rehearsing in Liverpool basements, but Richard Wayne Penniman, stage name Little Richard, stood frozen at the airplane window, staring at flames shooting from the engine. Until that moment he'd been living his brightest life. Tutti Frutti was spinning on radios, Long Tall Sally was tearing up the charts, and his stage costumes were getting more glittery, more wild, more scandalous with each passing show. But those flames, those red-orange flames bursting from the airplane engine, weren't just a technical malfunction. For Little Richard, they were a message from God, and that message would take him from the peak of rock and roll straight to the pulpit. The glittery costumes waiting backstage, the platform shoes, the lipstick and eyeliner, all of it would be burned because there was no room for makeup in the deal he made with God. Or so he thought. Before we continue with this incredible story, if you want to hear more untold stories from music history's most fascinating figures, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. The truth about what happened that night goes deeper than anyone imagined. The boy who couldn't fit. To understand what happened at 30,000 feet, you have to go back to Macon, Georgia, 1932, where a boy was born who would never quite fit the world's expectations. Richard Wayne Penniman came into this world as the third of 12 children, in a family that spoke to God daily but couldn't quite accept what God had created. His father, Charles Bud Penniman, was a church deacon who sold moonshine on the side, and young Richard inherited that same contradiction. By age 5, Richard was already performing for his family, discovering that when he sang, people stopped fighting, stopped judging, stopped seeing him as strange. His voice, that voice that would later shake auditoriums and define a generation, first emerged in the Macon churches, his soprano climbing higher than seemed humanly possible, his body swaying in ways that made the church mothers whisper. The contradiction was already forming. The church loved his voice but feared his movement. The rejection came brutally when Richard was 13. His father discovered him with his mother's makeup, threw him out with those devastating words, "Get out of my house, you little sissy." Just like that, Richard was homeless, performing for pennies, learning that survival meant performance, and performance meant hiding your true self behind whatever mask the audience demanded. He found refuge with the Johnsons, who ran the TikTok Club, and discovered that the stage was the only place where being different was celebrated instead of punished. Those teenage years in Macon's underground clubs became Richard's real education, learning from Sister Rosetta Tharpe and Billy Wright, performers who showed him you could be sacred and scandalous simultaneously, that makeup and wild performance could be armor against a hostile world. The birth of Little Richard. But Little Richard the phenomenon wasn't born until September 14, 1955, in a New Orleans recording studio at 3 in the morning. Richard had been trying for years, cutting records that went nowhere, performing in drag shows to survive, building a reputation as too wild, too much, too different for mainstream success. Producer Bumps Blackwell had been trying to capture Richard's electric live energy when, during a break, Richard sat down at the piano and started pounding out a rhythm he used to warm up audiences. A dirty little number full of sexual innuendo that could never appear on a record. But Blackwell heard the future in that chaos. "Play that again," he said, and within minutes they were recording Tutti Frutti, though the original lyrics had to be sanitized for white America's delicate sensibilities. What emerged was unlike anything the world had heard, Richard's voice soaring into a falsetto that was simultaneously masculine and feminine, the piano being attacked rather than played, lyrics that carried undeniable sexuality even when cleaned up. A wop bop a loo bop a lop bam boom wasn't just nonsense, it was the sound of a generation announcing itself, the death of the buttoned-up 50s, the birth of youth culture. Within weeks, Tutti Frutti was climbing charts it shouldn't have been on, making teenage girls scream and boys question everything they'd been taught about masculinity. Richard followed with Long Tall Sally, Rip It Up, Lucille, each song a hammer blow against racial and sexual convention. By 1956, Little Richard was bigger than Elvis in some markets, more dangerous than Chuck Berry, more uncontainable than anyone. The makeup got heavier, the hair got higher, the costumes more elaborate. On stage, Richard created a character that didn't exist in the real world, a black man who wore makeup and screamed and moved his body in ways that defied every masculine norm, and white America was paying to see it. But every night when the lights went down and the makeup came off, Richard faced himself in the mirror and saw not liberation but damnation. The church of his childhood still lived in his mind, whispering that everything he was doing on stage was sending him straight to hell. The Elvis encounter that changed everything. The backstage meeting with Elvis happened in December 1956 in New Orleans, and what Elvis saw that night would haunt both men forever. Elvis Presley, already crowned the king of rock and roll by white America, walked into Richard's dressing room unannounced at the Dewdrop Inn, a legendary venue in the black neighborhood where real rock and roll was still being born in smoky rooms far from the mainstream spotlight. What he witnessed in that moment was the raw, unfiltered truth behind the glittery facade that had captivated millions. Elvis caught Richard at his mirror, the harsh backstage lights exposing every detail as he mechanically removed his stage makeup with cold cream, revealing not just the exhausted face underneath but the profound exhaustion of living as two people simultaneously. According to Richard's road manager Leroy Little, who stood just outside the door and witnessed the entire encounter, Elvis stood frozen in that doorway for what felt like an eternity, his jaws slightly open, staring as Richard's hands moved robotically across his face, wiping away the carefully applied eyeliner that had made his eyes pop under the stage lights, removing the rouge that had given his cheeks that otherworldly glow, cleaning off the lipstick that had become his signature mark of rebellion. The transformation was both physical and metaphysical, watching little Richard disappear and Richard Wayne Penniman emerge, stripped of armor, vulnerable in ways the screaming crowds never saw. "How do you do it?" Elvis finally whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant sounds of the club's jukebox playing through the walls. "How do you just be so much yourself out there?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning, weighted with Elvis's own struggle to balance authenticity with commercial success, to be wild enough to excite audiences but tame enough not to threaten the social order that was making him millions. Richard's hands stopped moving, the cream-stained towel suspended in mid-air, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried none of the wild energy that had just shaken the stage. "I'm not myself out there," he said, meeting Elvis's eyes in the mirror's reflection. "I'm whoever they need me to be to feel alive, to feel free, to feel like they're witnessing something forbidden. The real me nobody wants to see, baby. They want little Richard, the show, the spectacle, the safe danger they can consume and then go back to their normal lives. Me? I don't get to go back to normal because this is my normal, and normal for me is what gets you kicked out of your father's house." The conversation that followed lasted nearly an hour. Two giants of American music sitting in that cramped dressing room, surrounded by the detritus of performance, discarded sequined jackets, platform shoes kicked into corners, the lingering smell of pomade and sweat, and something indefinable that was pure rock and roll energy dissipating into ordinary air. Richard explained that the stage persona wasn't freedom but a different kind of prison, perhaps even more confining because it promised liberation while delivering only a more elaborate cage. He could express his femininity and queerness on stage, yes, but only as entertainment, as spectacle, as something that existed in the liminal space of performance and disappeared the moment the curtain fell and the house lights came up. The makeup and costumes allowed him to be himself, but only as long as the audience understood it was a show, a performance, not a genuine expression of his identity that continued beyond the stage door. He told Elvis about that night when he was 13, about his father discovering him in his mother's clothes and makeup, about those words that still echoed in his mind every single day, "Get out of my house, you little sissy." He described sleeping in abandoned buildings, performing on street corners for pennies, learning that survival required becoming whatever the audience needed while burying who you really were so deep that sometimes you couldn't find that person anymore even when you were alone. People only accepted his difference, he explained to Elvis, when it made them money, when it brought them glory, when it could be consumed as entertainment rather than acknowledged as humanity. When Elvis, his face troubled and conflicted, asked if Richard was angry about white performers like himself getting rich off the sound that black performers had invented, about the cultural theft happening in real time across America as white artists sanitized black music for white audiences and made fortunes in the process, Richard's answer revealed a wound far deeper than economic exploitation. The music I don't care about. Take it, it belongs to everyone. It's meant to be shared and spread and transformed, Richard said, his voice growing stronger, more intense. Music is like air, like water, it flows where it needs to go. But what you can't take, what you'll never have to carry, is this. He gestured to his face, his body, his whole being. You get to be the sexy rebel who shakes his hips and drives the girls crazy, and then you go home to normalcy, to acceptability, to a world that sees you as a king instead of a freak. I am this all the time, every waking moment, every dream, every prayer. I can't take off being different like I take off this makeup. Normal never comes for me, baby. Normal was never an option. Richard then revealed something he'd never told another performer, a secret that had been eating away at him since his first moment in the spotlight, the constant, grinding terror of being himself on stage, the fear that accompanied every wild performance, every falsetto scream, every feminine gesture that made audiences gasp and cheer. Every performance was a tightrope walk between liberation and destruction, between expressing his true identity and confirming every racist and homophobic stereotype, between being celebrated as revolutionary and condemned as perverse. He described the voices in his head during performances, his mother praying for his soul, his father's hateful condemnations, preachers declaring him damned, audiences laughing at him rather than with him, the constant calculation of how much truth he could reveal before it became too dangerous, too real, too threatening to the social order that was simultaneously celebrating and destroying him. Elvis left that dressing room visibly shaken, his own performance suddenly feeling hollow and manufactured compared to the raw authenticity and profound cost of Richard's existence. His guitarist Scotty Moore later recalled that Elvis was unusually quiet on the drive back to their hotel, staring out the window at the New Orleans night, repeatedly saying, "We don't understand what it cost them, we just don't understand," without explaining who them was, though the meaning was clear. Some music historians believe this encounter was the beginning of Elvis's own spiritual and existential crisis, the moment when he started questioning whether fame and fortune were worth the price of authenticity, whether being the king was worth never being able to be simply Elvis Aaron Presley, a truck driver from Tupelo who loved his mama and wanted to be loved for who he really was. For Richard, the conversation was both cathartic and terrifying. He'd revealed his deepest fears and most profound pain to someone who could use that vulnerability against him, who represented everything complicated and contradictory about his existence: a white man profiting from black music, a straight man performing the sexuality that Richard had to hide, a normal man playing at wildness while Richard lived it every single moment. But it was also the first time he'd been fully honest with another performer about the cost of his revolution, about what it meant to be the architect of something that would make others free while keeping him imprisoned in his own contradictions. The Tour of Darkness. Throughout 1956 and into 1957, Richard toured constantly, 7 nights a week sometimes, living on pills and prayer, maintaining the wild persona while his inner world crumbled. The Australian tour was supposed to be a triumph, but Richard was falling apart. 28 shows in 30 days, traveling in planes held together by hope, performing while consuming alcohol, pills to stay awake, more pills to sleep, then locking himself in hotel rooms with a Bible, praying for forgiveness for sins he'd commit again on stage. Saxophone player Lee Allen later described those hotel rooms as crime scenes of identity, makeup scattered everywhere, Bibles open to passages about sin, empty bottles, and Richard swinging between manic performance energy and catatonic depression. The pressure intensified from all sides: religious protesters outside venues, newspaper articles questioning whether his performances corrupted youth. In Brisbane, a minister condemned Richard's demonic influence, specifically calling out his makeup and feminine movements. In Sydney, protesters tried to block the venue entrance. Richard read every condemnation, absorbed every attack, felt the weight of being both celebrated and reviled. His mother's letters begged him to give up this devil's music, reminded him his soul mattered more than fame. By the tour's final week, Richard was surviving on a dangerous cocktail of drugs and religious fervor, having what we'd now recognize as a complete breakdown, telling his manager he could feel demons in his room, that the makeup was becoming permanent, that he was losing himself completely. 30,000 feet above hell. The flight from Sydney on October 12, 1957, changed everything. Richard, exhausted and barely holding together, was staring out the window when flames began shooting from the engine, red-orange fire against black night that Richard saw as God's final warning. The plane shook violently, passengers genuinely frightened, the pilot considering emergency landing, but the terror inside Richard's mind exceeded the physical danger. In his most detailed account from a 1984 interview, Richard described hearing a voice, not in his ears but in his soul, saying, "Richard, you're living in sin, and if this plane goes down, you're going straight to hell." The voice listed his sins, the makeup, the feminine behavior, the wild performances, the secret encounters with men, the pride, the vanity, putting himself above God. Richard became hysterical, praying loudly, promising God anything if he'd spare the plane. Tour member Clint Brantley remembered Richard pulling out his worn Bible and reading scripture aloud, voice rising above the struggling engine, screaming about damnation, saying, "I'll give it all up, just don't let me die like this, don't let me burn." The bargain was specific. If God saved the plane, Richard would quit rock and roll immediately, throw away the makeup and costumes, enroll in theology school, dedicate his life to saving souls instead of entertaining them. The plane didn't crash. The pilot controlled the engine fire, made emergency landing in Fiji, continued after repairs. But little Richard, the performer, the wild man, the architect of rock and roll, effectively died in those flames. The man who landed back in the United States was Brother Richard Penniman, determined to fulfill his promise to God. First, he threw all his jewelry into the ocean from a Los Angeles pier, declaring vanity had no place in a godly life. Then came the costumes, platform shoes, makeup, all burned in a bonfire that his brother described as both cathartic and heartbreaking. The great renunciation and impossible return. Richard, at absolute peak fame, with Lucille climbing charts and promoters offering unprecedented money, simply walked away. He enrolled at Oakwood College, a Seventh-day Adventist institution, to become a minister. The industry was stunned, their wildest, most profitable star voluntarily abandoning millions for theology. Richard's response was always the same: "I've seen the flames of hell, and no amount of money is worth my eternal soul." The transformation was total, hair natural, face bare, conservative suits hiding his body. He gave testimony at churches, calling his rock and roll career demonic possession, warning young people that fame was Satan's tool to steal souls. But Richard couldn't escape his identity. The makeup and costumes were gone, performances stopped, but Richard was still the same person who'd been kicked out for being too feminine, who'd found love only with men, who'd discovered the only place he could be fully himself was on stage. He married Ernestine Campbell in 1959, trying to prove he could be normal, that the bargain could be fulfilled. But marrying a woman didn't change who he was attracted to, didn't fill the performing void, didn't quiet the voice saying he was living a lie for Jesus instead of living a lie for audiences. The marriage lasted 4 years of mutual misery. By 1962, Richard was watching performers he'd influenced: Elvis, Chuck Berry, newer acts, getting rich off foundations he'd laid while he studied theology and fought himself. The return started small, gospel recordings, then a tour with Sam Cooke, then inevitably full Little Richard performances with makeup and wild shows like he'd never left. The audiences went insane, money flowed again, and Richard felt alive for the first time in 5 years. But the guilt was crushing. Every performance felt like betraying God. Every dollar stained with sin. Richard began alternating between wild rock and roll and equally intense religious renunciation, a pattern defining the rest of his life. Perform 6 months, quit for 6 months. Rock album, then gospel album, full Little Richard on stage, then condemning rock and roll at church. The pattern revealed he genuinely believed rock and roll was sinful, but couldn't survive without performing, couldn't live without being the wild, impossible version of himself that only existed on stage. The cocaine years and cultural theft. The 1970s brought serious drug addiction, making his cycling more chaotic. Cocaine became his method for managing impossible contradictions, for performing with expected energy while carrying crushing religious guilt. His performances became erratic, sometimes brilliant, sometimes disasters, sometimes cancelled when he couldn't make it to stage. Friends described him as barely functional, spending days with drugs and religious texts, experiencing psychotic breaks where he couldn't distinguish divine visions from hallucinations. The lowest point came in 1977, at the Aladdin Casino in Las Vegas, a near-fatal overdose combined with complete psychological breakdown. He performed Lucille, left to standing ovation, then collapsed backstage mumbling about hell, clutching a Bible in one hand and empty cocaine vial in the other. Meanwhile, he watched performers he'd influenced become bigger, richer, more celebrated than he'd ever been. The Beatles were most painful. They'd learned Long Tall Sally from his records. Paul McCartney perfected his impression. They openly credited him, but they also represented everything painful about his position. They'd taken his innovations and made it acceptable for white audiences, marketable, safe. They got to be rebellious, break boundaries, then grow up, become elder statesmen. Richard broke the same boundaries, pushed further, risked more, and got treated as a novelty act, a historical curiosity, someone who influenced real artists but wasn't quite real himself. The racial dimension was obvious. White performers profited more from rock and roll than black creators. But for Richard, there was another layer. Performers like Elvis and Beatles could flirt with femininity, wear makeup, shake hips, but it read as sexy rebellion because they were straight, white, ultimately conventional. Richard's femininity wasn't performance, it was who he was, and that authenticity made him threatening in ways calculated rebellion never could. AIDS, legacy, and final contradictions. The 1980s brought the AIDS crisis and Richard's tortured relationship with the gay community. He'd spent his life in a painful closet, sometimes claiming to be gay, sometimes claiming deliverance through prayer, sometimes insisting rumors were lies. When AIDS decimated the community, Richard watched friends die while maintaining his ambiguous stance. He donated to AIDS organizations quietly, attended memorials privately, but publicly spoke about homosexuality as sin while performing in gay clubs and accepting LGBTQ adoration. Backstage in 1987, Richard broke down about a former lover who died of AIDS. "I can't even mourn him properly. I can't say what he meant to me. I have to pretend he was just a friend while inside I'm dying too." In 1998, Prince made a secret pilgrimage to Richard's Tennessee home, seeing in Richard a cautionary tale about inability to reconcile artistic truth with spiritual needs. Their hours-long conversation ranged across race, sexuality, spirituality, and revolution's cost. Richard told stories never shared in interviews, about moments when religious guilt crushed artistic freedom, about hidden lovers, about the person he might have been if the world had allowed him to exist whole. Prince left shaken, later telling associates, "He showed me what happens when you let fear win, when you believe being yourself is a sin you have to atone for." Richard's final decades were strange mixtures of recognition and continued struggle. Awards, Hall of Fame inductions, interviews with different versions of stories, different explanations for sexuality and religious experiences. What remained consistent was underlying pain, the sense he'd never found peace, never reconciled different truths of his existence. In a 2010 interview, he spoke with unusual honesty. "I see these young artists now, and they can just be themselves. They can be gay, wear makeup, do whatever, and nobody tells them they're going to hell. I spent my whole life going to hell and back, trying to be both things, and I don't know if I ever succeeded at either one." The end and eternal division. When Richard died May 9, 2020, at his Tennessee home, the world lost rock and roll's true architect. But the deeper tragedy was that Richard had never been able to enjoy his own revolution, never lived freely in the world he'd helped create. His final hours, according to son Danny, were filled with the same contradictions defining his life. Richard asked for his Bible, read scripture, prayed for salvation, but also hummed Tutti Frutti, remembered performances, talked about the music that had made him famous and damned equally. He couldn't let go of either one, Danny said. Right until the end he was both Little Richard and Brother Richard, and they were still fighting. Looking back at those 1957 flames, it's clear Richard saw more than mechanical failure or divine warning. He saw his impossible position, saw the flames of hell he believed awaited him for being himself, saw the destruction from trying to exist in a world with no place for someone like him. The bargain he made at 30,000 feet was a false choice, desperate attempt to solve a problem with no solution, because the real issue wasn't music or performance or sexuality. It was a culture demanding he choose between different aspects of his humanity, requiring fragmentation as the price of existence. The tragedy of Little Richard isn't that he struggled with sexuality or faith. Many artists struggle. The tragedy is he was never allowed to struggle honestly. never given space to figure out who he was without constant threat of damnation, rejection, erasure. Every moment after those flames was spent trying to pay an impossible debt, trying to atone for sins that weren't sins but simply aspects of his being. And in that futile attempt, the world lost not just a performer but a complete human being who might have shown us all how to be whole in a world demanding division. The flames Richard saw at 30,000 feet weren't just threatening his life, they were revealing a truth about his world, a world that would never let him land safely, never let him exist without crisis, never let him be both Little Richard and Richard Wayne Penniman in the same body at the same time. When he died 63 years after making that bargain, the question remained, had he ever escaped those flames, or had he spent his entire life burning, sacrificing himself piece by piece, trying to become acceptable enough to deserve the life he'd been given? The answer is that Richard never escaped. The flames followed him to every stage, every church, every private mirror moment where he saw a stranger who was too much and not enough simultaneously. Rock and roll gained a king and lost a human being, and Richard himself gained the world's recognition while losing the ability to recognize himself.